Thank you everyone for coming to this online workshop on reusing data for dissertation projects. This is an introduction to secondary analysis for qualitative and quantitative data. My name is Maureen Haaker, and I've been working with the UK Data Service for over 10 years on everything from ingesting collections and digitizing data to reuse projects. And I also lecture at the University of Suffolk. And I'm here with my colleague, Alle Bloom. Alle, did you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Maureen. Hi, everyone. I'm Alle Bloom. I work with the user support and training team based at the University of Manchester. In particular, work with survey data, help answering queries on the help desk, and aid with things like data discovery and teaching materials. So great to have you all join us today. Thanks, Maureen.
If this is your first online workshop, rest assured that you're all muted. And if you have a question as we go along, again, please feel free to type that into the Q&A option on your Zoom menu. We're going to try and monitor some of those questions throughout the workshop and answer as many as possible as we go along. But hopefully we should have some time at the end as well, just to cover any frequently asked questions. So here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to go through this process of what is secondary analysis. And we'll start off with an explanation of the method itself, then dive into how you would find data, how you design your project. We're going to talk a little bit about documentation as well and how you might use it. There's also some discussion on data considerations to make, and then wider project considerations. At the end, we'll do some signposting to further resources, and we do have some activities throughout to kind of help you get going on a project before you leave the workshop today. Before we get too far along, I did want to address a simple point first. What is secondary analysis? So in short, secondary analysis is a method which asks new questions of old data. So it's analyzing data that you have not collected yourself. So usually researchers collect far more data than they actually need to answer their own research questions. So think about, for example, national surveys, which collect a lot of data on a representative sample, or qualitative studies, which will have interviews that last 1 or 2 hours or sometimes more. Those data sets can answer a lot of different questions, and they can be analyzed using a lot of different techniques. So secondary analysis makes use of that data and basically just reuses something that's been collected by someone else. There is a complicated nuance here around terminology. So you might have heard other terms that are used to describe this method. I sometimes hear secondary data analysis, or data reuse projects, or just reuse projects. And it's just to point out that all of these terms are referring to the same exact method, so don't get too confused by this. There is an ongoing debate, perhaps, about how to call this method. So in 2007, Libby Bishop wrote this article on the primary-secondary dualism. Basically, she was making the argument that there might be a privileging of methods where you go out and collect data yourself, and using terms like secondary analysis or secondary data sometimes may reinforce that hierarchy, but actually primary and secondary analysis are a lot more similar than different if you fully considered all of the key methodological issues of secondary analysis as a method. So consequently, you'll find an increase of the term data reuse, and that is a term that we'll use throughout the workshop too. And that just takes into account the huge range of ways that data can be used and reused. And it doesn't imply that any of those projects are secondary to the initial use of data. You can use whatever term ends up coming to mind first. Just be aware there are a couple of ways of describing this process of reusing data, and we will kind of interchange the use of those terms as well in this workshop. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the research process as a whole. So you're hopefully familiar with this model. It starts out with some kind of general direction for your research. You'll do a bit of background research into the literature already written on your topic, and then from there, hopefully, you're inspired to ask a research question which builds on that body of research. Once you have that research question, you then decide what is the best way of answering it and you design your project. And once you've settled on your method, you go out, you collect the data, you analyze it, and then you begin your write-up, which is what you end up submitting for your dissertation. So if we can just look at the next cycle. Now you might have a few extra steps, or you might swap a couple of those steps depending on your theoretical foundation. But generally speaking, this is how we normally think about the research process. When you're doing a project on secondary analysis, however, this process looks a little bit different. So this model clearly shows how, a research question is normally built from your chosen topic area. However, secondary analysis, the research question is derived directly from the data. So you start with a topic that you're interested in, but instead of immediately going out to look at the literature, you look for data first and you start evaluating those collections and seeing what kind of data might be suitable. When you find a collection that intrigues you, you then ask a question, a research question of that data. And then from there, hopefully, you would find some literature that exists on that question. You then don't need to collect the data, you just need to access it, which is, of course, one of the key advantages of secondary analysis. The data is already collected. You just need to get your hands on it, either by downloading it from the catalog page, and we'll go over what that is in just a little bit, or you may need to actually go into the archive if it's only available in paper form. Once you have it, you then analyze it and you write up your dissertation. So the key point that I'm making here is around reusing data for a dissertation project is, it's about where this research question comes from. It would take a lot of time and a lot of inside knowledge about the data that already exists in the archives to be able to come up with a research question just out of the blue and then be able to find the perfect data to answer it. You'd be looking for that right data for a very long time, unless, of course, you do have really good knowledge about the collections that are already held in the archive. So for a dissertation project, when your time and resources are limited, you'll want to look at the data first, and then from there, develop a research question, which gives you a new take on that data. And you can, of course, spend some time looking for the right data and evaluating it. But for a dissertation project, you may want to look and see what data exists on your general topic area first before you really nail down your specific research question. I think it makes the research process a lot smoother for you if you do it that way. Okay. So now that we have an idea about what secondary analysis is, we're going to talk about finding data for reuse. And before we do that, we have another Mentimeter poll for you. So it should be using the same code. And we're just going to ask you, what topics are you interested in? And you should just be able to fill in a text field. And in a minute, once we get some responses, we'll be able to see a word cloud develop. Here we go. Yeah, so just go back to menti.com and pop that code in again if you did leave Menti. Excellent. So we've got quite a range going here. Okay, so the size of the word will replicate how many responses it's had. So we've got a number of people who are interested in politics, criminology, and reproductive health. But we also have quite a wide range as well. So I just saw one, and it keeps moving, policy making on drugs, which is fantastic. Gender bias in medicine, some quite hard-hitting topics actually. Voting systems. Already I can start to think of some data sets that we have that might be of interest for those interested in any of the political topics, and in particular voting preferences and that sort of thing. So we have a qualitative longitudinal study, the qualitative election study of Britain, but we do also have some quantitative surveys as well that cover social attitudes and political attitudes. Understanding society is another one that might be of interest. Okay, great. So now we're just to sort of point out, okay, so we've got some interesting topics to look at, but where do you find data? Um, and this is where the UK Data Service comes in. So the UK Data Service is an archive which holds the largest collection of social sciences data in the UK. We're a comprehensive resource that is funded by the ESRC, and our main job is to be a single point of access to a wide range of secondary social science data. So the main purpose then is the collection and the ingest and the processing of data, and then the further dissemination of that data for people to use. And in addition to that data infrastructure core, we also have this service layer, which provides extensive support, training, and guidance. So really, there's kind of two elements to what we have at the UK Data Service. We have an archive that holds data sets, and then we also have a service which provides guidance and training. Okay. So without further ado, I think what we're going to do now is start jumping into the data catalog. So we have an activity for you on finding data. So I think Alle was just about to pull up the worksheet, but you should also get a link land in the chat in just a second. What we're going to do is look at one of the key tools that the UK Data Service offers, which is our data catalog, where you can start looking for data on some of those topics that you listed in Menti. So if you click on the link that Emma has sent through in the chat, you'll get to a worksheet. And it will ask you to go to our data catalog, which you can see displayed here on the screen. And what you would do is just in that really tempting search bar right in the middle, you'll want to just type in some topics that you might be interested in, or there's some directions on a few topics that you can explore, as well as how to filter some of those results using the facets on the left-hand side of the data catalog once you start your search. So I'll give you about 5 minutes or so just to have a little explore of the data catalog. If you do have any issues that you run into, feel free to pop those questions into the chat or into the Q&A box, and we can have a look at those. There is no sound. It's just time to work on the activity. So we've got the worksheet. Emma has sent through a link to this worksheet if you want to bring it up on your own computer. Otherwise, it's displayed on the screen here. And if you just go to the data catalog using the link on there and just have an explore, see what you can find, what data sets might be of interest. And then we've also asked you to browse some of that data using the facets on the left-hand side. So when you start a search, you'll see there are some facets that show up on the left-hand side, so you can filter by the data type, etc. So it's worth just kind of having an explore of the data catalog initially, but we can talk through it really quick too. Someone's just asked a great question, which I just wanted to cover really quick. And that was about the difference between the tab that says studies and the tab that says reshare studies. So hopefully as you're kind of exploring it, you can see already, thank you, Alle, there's going to be a few different tabs along the top. So you can either have studies, which refers to some of our in-house curated studies, or you can have reshare studies, which is our self-deposit system where researchers have curated the data themselves and deposited that with us. So both of them will be data sets. It's just when things are curated in-house, we have a very stringent and consistent templates basically that we use for how that collection looks. So with reshare, there's like a minimum expectation of what we would want to see, how the data is formatted and what kind of documentation they have. With the studies, the in-house curated stuff, it's very stringent. It has to be this. So you might get a little bit more variability of how the collection looks when you're looking at reshare studies. It's a little bit more predictable how it looks with studies, but both tabs will show you data sets and both tabs have been collected by researchers. It's just how they're curated. There's also a couple other tabs. So there's the series tab, which will show you some of our larger kind of longitudinal surveys. And just that those surveys will have different waves. So when I say they're longitudinal, they're done over time, and periodically you get a new wave of data collection within that study, within that larger project. So those series kind of collect all of those different waves of data collection together for a single study. And then the variables tab will allow you to search the kind of variables that you might see in some of those surveys. So there's no data under the variables tab, right? This is a tab to kind of explore what sorts of questions are asked on surveys about that topic. So hopefully that helps kind of clarify some of the different parts of our data catalog. And you can see on the left-hand side there, those are the facets that I had mentioned. So you can browse by data type, you can, put in particular dates, you can browse by we're going to talk a little bit more about data access level as well, but those browsing facets are sometimes quite useful.
Thanks, Maureen. And I'd just like to flag something while we've got the catalogue open as well, because we're going to be talking a little bit about catalogue pages later, and how they can help you get more information about the data set that you're going to access. So I just want to give you an example to find the catalogue page for a data set. Pretty easy, just click on it and the page that it takes you to is the catalogue page. So when you hear us talking later about, go to the catalogue page for this information, that's the process for finding it. And all of the studies have this reshare, and the normal studies and the series pages also have similar information as well. So just to flag that, because we will be talking about catalogue pages later as well.
Fantastic. So we've got back to our Menti just to see what sorts of things you guys have started to find. And I know there have been a couple of questions as well about very specific topics that people were looking for as well. So we'll try to address those, I think, within the Q&A. But what sorts of data sets did you find already? So we've got the Financial Capability Survey, the British Social Attitude Survey, of course, big survey. Ooh, Adultery, an analysis of love and betrayal. I love Annette Lawson's 1980s exploration of adultery. It was quite seminal because it was no research at that point, anyways, had kind of been done on that topic. So you do get some really interesting data sets where they're done on quite sensitive or challenging topics. Got the Active Lives of Children and Young People survey, the Crime Survey for England and Wales, excellent. British Preschool Children's Play Survey. Yeah, there is a growing collection of data about children, which is sometimes very hard to research on your own as well because of the number of ethical considerations. So if you're interested on research with children, there is a couple of studies on research with children with autism. So for the one who is looking for that, you may need to have much broader kind of topic that you're looking for. But I do know there's a couple of qualitative data sets on children with autism. We've got the Family Resources Survey too, the OECD Environmental Statistics, excellent. So if you stay within the studies, the in-house curation, you're probably going to end up landing on a lot of our national kind of more representative surveys. If you're looking specifically for something that is not surveys, you may need to lean into some of the reshare studies. So the things that we tend to curate in-house are things that are much more nationally representative, and qualitative work by nature of the kind of method it is tends to be much smaller scale. So they tend to go via our reshare curation route. Okay, so it looks like a number of you are already starting to find some data. You might already have some topics that you want to explore. We've just kind of listed here some examples of some common topics that we find that students are looking for, like the environment or workforce patterns or healthcare. And we've listed some data set examples, and I think some of you already found these as well, like the OECD environmental statistics. But we do also have, like, for example, more qualitative study, government-led change interviews with UK and German MPs on climate change. So that is a collection of, I believe it was 61 politicians that they interviewed in total. For workforce patterns, we have things like the labor force survey. Healthcare, of course, we have the health survey for England, but we do also have a lot of qualitative studies looking at healthcare too, such as mothers and daughters, accounts of health in the grandmother generation. So this is an older study, but a great one because they interview different generations within the same family about some of their health practices. For family spending, I think somebody mentioned they had found the Family Resources Survey. There's also a lot of other examples like Mothers Alone, which is a qualitative collection interviewing mothers living on welfare, single mothers living on welfare. There's a lot of criminology work as well. So we've got, of course, Hold the Crime Survey. There's a lot of examples of qualitative studies equally. Some of the titles were actually too long to fit on this particular slide, but we do have some people's perceptions, public perceptions rather, of the crime in the UK. We also have a fair number of collections on the pandemic. So if you're interested in that, we also do it where we also have a lot of collections that look at specific groups. So the care leavers, for example, is a good data set specifically looking at how COVID impacted a specific group of people. In this case, those who were children in care who were transitioning out of the care system. And then I know politics was a hot topic as well. So of course we have the British Social Attitude Survey and the Qualitative Election Study of Britain. And this slide is just giving you a little bit more examples of some of our more recent acquisitions, just to give you an idea of the variety and breadth of data that we take in. So if you're interested in political views or in generational differences or the cost of living or even, quote unquote taboo type of topics like drug use or drinking, we have data on these sorts of things. Secondary analysis as a method, I think, is particularly useful for exploring some of those sensitive topics that might otherwise be very difficult to navigate ethical approval. And it's also good if you're trying to explore hard to reach populations where you might not have the time or the resources or even just the access that's needed to sample the population. So we tend to think of people within wider society once they are kind of part of an institution in a way. So if they become a prisoner and they're in the criminal justice system, or if they become, a child taken into care, you start to hit some of those institutional walls, which makes research that much harder. So secondary analysis is a great way to try and access some of those populations or to explore some of those more challenging topics and sensitive topics. Okay, so we've defined the method, we've talked about the data out there, and now I think it's time to talk about project design. So what kind of research design can you do with secondary analysis, or what kinds does it lend itself toward, and what measurements should you consider? So while you might be exploring data without a specific question in mind and instead just seeing what's out there on the topic, you may want to start thinking about what kind of research design your project will follow. So there's 4 types of reuse projects, which I think can lend themselves well to a dissertation project. And these are reanalysis, replication study, a comparative study, and a restudy. So reanalysis is probably the one that comes to mind when you're thinking about what secondary analysis is. And this involves thinking about the wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. So it usually means asking some kind of different research question from what the original researchers were trying to do. So for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. Now, the original illness narratives had been looked at exclusively for health research. The interviews were meant to explore how diagnoses are made. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were much more interested in the analysis of the discussions between patients and doctors rather than the actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that kind of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the original research, but have a slightly different focus. So, for example, Joanna Bornat looked at gerontology as a topic and found two different data sets that were looking specifically at that topic. But Bornat's research question was on racism, which wasn't the specific focus of the original work of the data set she's found, but those data sets were rich enough to allow her to explore that theme within the existing data. Now, if you want to use the same exact analysis strategy, that would be a replication study, and that's also another possible research design. So right now there's a real concern about reproducibility of research, and replication studies can often reveal some of the messiness that's involved in working through data. One of the most famous or really infamous examples of replication is from Thomas Herndon, who was a postgraduate student at University of Massachusetts. So he was assigned an assessment to replicate the results of a published study. So he chose Reinhardt and Rogoff's 2010 paper, Growth in the Time of Debt. And basically, that paper came up with the proportion at which your national debt can be of your GDP before you start to see negative economic growth. So Thomas Herndon pulled up the OECD data to rerun the analysis as the paper had laid out, and he got a completely different answer. So the paper published said that debt can't exceed 90% of the GDP. However, he calculated that the debt can actually exceed the GDP. So he ended up having to contact the original investigators, and he found a flaw in their data set where they had miscopied some of the cells from the data that they had downloaded into the file that they were working with. So the full story of this was published in 2013 in the New Yorker, if you're interested in reading a bit more detail about it. And hopefully a replication study won't always find flaws in the original study like this, but nonetheless, this is a study design that's worth considering, and it definitely helps you appreciate the research process. You could even develop a project whereby you rerun a series of studies on the same topic, or you explore a really complicated data sets, trying to work through missing data and transforming variables and so on. You can also do comparative work. So you might be looking at an international comparison between two countries or comparing social subgroups of the population based on a shared social characteristic. Or you can compare across time. So look at data that's been gathered in the past and compare it to the present. Again, kind of having these two comparison groups is something that's much easier if you already have existing data. And sometimes it's impossible to do that comparative without at least a bit of secondary analysis. So for example, if you wanted to compare something across time, well, you can't go back in time to collect data. You have to use what's already there. So you can compare samples across time, across geographic place, gender, ethnicity, any kind of those characteristics are usually collected as a standard, certainly in larger surveys. And that kind of data would be present as well within more qualitative studies. Okay, so the final example of reuse I'll go through is a restudy, and I've got a case study. So on the next slide, it's got an example of a restudy. So, and this is basically where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. So it does a little bit of secondary analysis, but it also allows you scope to collect a little bit of your own data. And this example is from a reuse project that stemmed from the collection School Leavers Study. So the original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. As part of the project, Paul had asked teachers to set a particular essay just before students were due to leave school, and it prompted them to imagine that they were reaching the end of their life, and something made them think back to the time that they left school. And they were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. So on the next slide, we've got a picture of Ray Paul, who's on the right there, with Graham Crow, who did a restudy of this collection. So in 2009, Graham Crow and Don Lyon decided to reanalyze the data set, focusing solely on student aspirations. And using the very same methodology, they conducted a restudy on the Isle of Sheppey at the same school for school leavers in 2009-2010 academic year. So the prompt that was supplied to students in the newer data collection was nearly the same. Imagine that you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. And they then transcribed the essays and compared the themes from the old set of essays to the new set of essays. And you can see the wording of the prompt there and a little snippet of one of the essays there at the bottom of the page. And the findings are fascinating, and they show the difference in young people's aspirations after one generation. 40 years of time had passed. So how exactly were they different? Well, in 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and it followed on from hard work. And sometimes there were talks of periods of unemployment or being on the dole or even death or the early death of someone they loved. And you can see a few examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays that exemplify some of those themes. So you have a quote on the bottom, for example, "I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory." Fast forward to 2010, however, and this showed students imagining well-paid and instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also a lot of uncertainty. And Graham Crow and his team were also kind of noting the clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So, for example, you have the quote on the bottom there of a girl who says, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper, horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous." So quite the difference there. So on the next slide, you can see that this study is part of a much larger one that, might be a little too large for a dissertation project. The goal of this project was to engage the community alongside the research and find innovative ways of including participants in the research outputs. So as part of that initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which was meant to create this kind of shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey means among that community. And while this would be a really ambitious project for maybe a dissertation, it is a good example of how you can combine a bit of data collection and a bit of data reuse into one project. And for those of you who might be doing postgraduate work, like PhD or something, this is certainly something you could consider for one of your projects. For others, where you have much more limited time, you can certainly design a much more feasible study with a smaller sample and smaller outputs. Okay, and I think this is where I'm going to hand over to Alle to talk a little bit about measurements.
Great, thanks, Maureen. So, yeah, now we have a bit of an idea of what secondary analysis is like, thinking about applying this to your own project. So, I'm going to look a little bit about the process of refining your project and your questions through that exploration of the data that Maureen was talking about earlier. So, your question coming from the data. So, let's say you have a general idea of your topic area and you're starting to think about which data you might use to explore it. A good place to start is by thinking about what you're trying to measure. This is key for whatever type of project you're trying to undertake, but in particular for a quantitative reuse project, you're really going to want to know what your key concepts are so you can relate these to variables within a data set. And as we said earlier, you can find lots of information on the catalogue page. The list of variables can usually be found in the documentation or user guide, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about this later, but just to flag, that's where you can usually find that variable information that you're going to want to start looking at to think about how to conceptualize your questions and what data you might want to use. So, for example, let's say I'm interested in looking at the relationship between fear of crime and age. Maybe I've seen something in the media or I've seen some interesting literature and I'm thinking, yeah, this is something that I want to explore. So, my key concepts here are fear of crime and age. So, we need to find some data which has variables that measure these concepts and will allow us to formulate and answer a research question about them. And because, as Maureen said earlier, it's hard to find the perfect data set sort of from the off, and we want to start from the data. It's good to start from this kind of broader topic, then derive your key concepts and questions from some of those variables that already exist. That said, if you do already have a question in mind, maybe you've done a research proposal assignment or had a previous discussion with your supervisor, you can always search for data in line with this, but you might just want to keep in mind that you'll have to be flexible and maybe revise your question based on what data is available. So in this example, we want data on crime, so we might look at something like the crime survey for England and Wales, which I knew some of you found when we did the search task earlier. So to give you a little bit of information about it, it's a large and quite important survey because it provides a source of information independent from official police crime statistics. So it's an alternate source of information. It's what we call a repeated cross-sectional survey. So if you wanted to search for it, you would find it under that series tab. If you wanted to see all of the sort of versions of this that have occurred together. So that means it's repeated at sort of a regular time sequence over time. It's done every year. And it surveys 35,000 individuals aged 16 plus and 3,000 children aged 10 to 15. So back to our variables. So I've had a look in the code book. I've gone to my documentation and I can see that the crime survey for England and Wales has two variables that I think might be good to measure our key concepts. So the first of these is qual life, which is how much is your own quality of life affected by fear of crime on a scale of 1 to 10, and age, which records the respondent's age. So now we've found these variables, we need to think carefully about what they actually measure to sort of evaluate whether they're suitable. So when I'm looking at the qual life variable there, I'm thinking, does this really measure fear of crime, or is the question actually asking how much fear of crime affects these individuals' lives? And this is just one example, but with all your variables, this is something you'll need to think about and consider. Go back and look at the questionnaire. What was the question asking, and what answer would the respondents be giving when they were asked this question? As well as considering your variables and concepts, you might also want to consider the kind of analysis you want to do or can do with the data. So Maureen's gone through some different types of analysis earlier, talking about reuse and comparative studies. And when it comes to quantitative analysis, the type of analysis you'll want to do depends on the kind of data you want to use. So if you want to look at individuals at one particular point in time, you would use a cross-sectional survey. Maybe if you want to look at particular moods around an election, something that occurred in a particular year. If you want to look at multiple points in time, you'd use a repeated cross-sectional survey. Or if you wanted to follow the same groups of people over time, you may be interested in longitudinal data. If you want data on small geographic areas, so local authorities or local councils, you'd want to use the census data because that allows you to analyze that geographical information. And if you're interested in comparing countries over time, you might want to use our international time series data. It's also important to think about your population. That's the group that you want to measure. So, for example, this might be the population of the world, the UK, or perhaps a particular city or local authority area. And as well as this, you also want to consider your unit of analysis. So, are you interested in individual people? So, some surveys survey individual people. Or are you interested in households? So some surveys also interview multiple people within a household and link their data so you can kind of explore that together as a whole. And this will affect which data you can use, as some data sets are only available for particular geographies or for certain units. And all of this information is something that can be found in the documentation. I know we repeat this a lot, but it is the place where you can find answers to these questions. So, as I said earlier, you can find the documentation on the catalogue page once you click on a study. It's always a really good idea to thoroughly read the page before you download the data. It's a good way to see how suitable it might be, give you an overview of the key topics and background, and also a brief overview of the methodology. So these little drop-down menus here, the main topics, the coverage and methodology, etc., those give you a quick snapshot view about the data set, when it was collected, what area it covered, is it individuals or households? So that's a great way to get started looking at that. You can also access the documentation here. So this includes things like user guides, that original questionnaire that I was talking about, and technical reports, and any notes added by the data producers. Sometimes changes are made to the data afterwards, after it's been deposited with us, and it's really good to be aware of what those changes are as well. One thing in particular you should explore when you're evaluating quantitative data is something called questionnaire routing. And I like to refer to that as who was asked what. So as we said, the documentation contains information on the variables, but it also contains information on the questionnaire used to collect the data. And to understand the data and answer all those questions of who it was asked to, what your population is, we need to understand the questionnaire and we need to understand this routing. This is because many questionnaires use something we call computer-aided interviewing. This sends the respondents through the questionnaire by different routes depending on their previous answers. So, for example, for the crime survey, it would ask a respondent their age, and then if they answer their ages between 10 to 15, they are sent through a different sort of young person's questionnaire route instead of the adult's questionnaire route. So they go through differently depending on previous answers. And this means that many questions in a survey may only be applicable to some of the sample. So it's always a really good idea to check the documentation and see who was asked about the variables that you are interested in. So this is an example of a variable called flex10 from the labour force survey. This relates to what's called special working arrangements, things like working part-time, flexi time, etc. You can see the exact wording of the questionnaire here. So in your main job, is your agreed working arrangement any of the following? And then the respondents would choose their answer. And underneath just here where it says applies if work during the reference week, we can see that this question was asked to people who are in work, respondents who are in work. And all of these codes down here are basically how they identified who was in work by their responses to other questions or variables. So that's sort of the route they followed to be given this question. You'll find the documentation might look a little bit different across different data sets, but this gives you a general idea of what to expect. You can also find information about how the data was processed after collection, and you might come across something that we call derived variables. These are variables that are created from the raw data. So here's an example. This shows the flex10 variable, which we were looking at on the last slide, and it's been used to derive a variable with the code name flexw7. So this figure shows how the variable has been derived by taking into account the responses from the original variable. So stick with me on this. I know it looks a bit confusing, but basically everyone who responded 7 on the original variable, indicating they had a 0 hours contract, are coded as 1 on the new flex W7 variable, and therefore this new variable indicates whether someone has a 0 hours contract or not. Not all documentation contains these diagrams, and in some survey data set, it will just be the SPSS or the status syntax, which shows you how these variables have been derived. But the main point is it's really important that you understand the origin, background, and the questions behind any variables that you are planning on using. I'm now going to hand you back to Maureen. She's going to give you a bit of an idea of what the documentation looks like in quali data sets. So bear with us while we swap our screen share just a sec.
Okay, lovely. So, so all of that documentation applies for quantitative surveys. Qualitative also have documentation. It does look a little bit different. So when you first download a qualitative data set, you'll get a zipped folder that looks a bit like this. So you've got some folders here and they are stuffed with files. Most qualitative data is held as what we call an RTF, a rich text format. So in order to actually find the data, you go into the RTF folder. This folder, once you open it, looks like this, which hopefully looks a little bit more familiar to you as a word processing document. So there's your data, all nicely organized, and clicking on one of those files would open up a file that looks a bit like this. So this is a snippet of a school leavers study essay and what it looks like in its entirety. That particular RTF folder has over 100 of those files, but the files don't have to be just essays or interview transcripts. You might, for example, have PDFs of handwritten notes, like in the upper left-hand corner, or you might have ethnographic notes, like those that are on the right. And some collections may also have images or videos like those in the lower left-hand corner. If you are looking for video or audio data, just be aware that there's a lot more issues with sharing image and audio data, so it's not something that we have a lot of, but we do have some examples of video and audio. Most likely, you're going to wind up opening up an interview transcript like this one that's seen here. It should have some clear, what we call turn taking and speaker tags, so you know who is talking. There's a lot of different types of data that's available, so make sure you have a good look through the collection first and see what's actually in there. Okay, so once you've explored the collection as a whole, you want to make sure that you are orienting yourself to the project. And I think the main point when you're thinking about all this different type of documentation, all the different files that are in the collection, the main thing here is not to underestimate the amount of time that it will take to get acquainted with the data set. I mean, Alle just went through a single variable and how to understand that single variable, but just imagine that replicated across a survey. Or, you know, I showed you a few screenshots of some of the files that you might have in a collection. Again, it's thinking about the amount of time that it might take to go through each of those files. On top of that, there might be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand that data. And what I mean by that is you might have more than just the data or just the documentation to look at. You might need to consider, for example, the wider political or social context of the study as a whole. You might need to think about the wider circumstances of the sample, the actual group of participants in that study. Or you might need to start considering the basic social characteristics of a single participant. You might need to think about the historical time period that the data was collected in or where the data was collected. So really, the idea is that in order to understand the data set as a whole, in order to really get at the root of what the data can convey, you need to really take some time and go through all of that documentation and recontextualize that collection. Every collection archived at the UK Data Service will have some documentation that's provided alongside the data. So with qualitative studies specifically, we call this a user guide. And there it is. And it contains more information about the methodology. So it might have information about the interview schedule or the call for participants, or sometimes it includes segments from publications arising out of the original study. Or I've also seen things like funding applications that have been put into the user guide. So here's an example of a user guide. This one happens to have an interview guide for the interviewers. It also has a blank consent form. There's a little write-up about what the sample was, so a little sample profile. It also just has further background information just to help you understand how that data was collected. Should you want to know about the participants themselves? Qualitative studies also have what's called a data listing. Now, with surveys, you would just open up the data itself and you'd be able to see, the sort of basic demographic details that are usually completed first and foremost at a start of a survey. You would just be able to see that. Don't necessarily have an equivalent in qualitative. So we provide this data listing instead. And this is what one of those looks like. It's just a table that gives you a brief overview of the participants in the collection. So each row represents a piece of data or usually a participant. And each column then will list some kind of characteristic or attribute of that particular data file. So it's a quick way of getting to know who took part in this study. Some of those columns will look different. So when researchers are depositing their collections with us, we tell them to, design the data list around what kind of characteristics they thought were important. Or sometimes they do hold back particular characteristics so that it's not disclosive. So these are just kind of quick overviews, at a glance guides to who took part in this study. Okay, so now we have an activity to help you get started and get to grips with the documentation. So while Emma is popping a link for that worksheet in the chat, I'm just going to pause my screen share. Oh, I believe Ellie is on top of it already. So she's just opened up rather, the next worksheet on catalog and documentation. And she'll talk you through kind of getting to grips with documentation for a specific collection called Understanding Society.
Great, thanks, Maureen. Hopefully everyone can see that on the screen, and we've also got the link in the chat. Thank you very much, Emma. So yeah, what we're just going to do is go to that catalogue page that we were talking about earlier and see if you can use the catalogue page to find some of the answers to the questions below. So in part one, you should be able to find all those answers either on the catalogue page or in some of the documentation. So do have an explore of that, maybe note down your answers or keep them in your head, because we're going to come back in a minute and feed into sort of Mentimeter to see what answers we all found. And then part two, Maureen, do you want to introduce this? This is a mixed methods study.
Yeah, so for part two, you've got a different collection there. And it's just going to prompt you for a couple of questions for you to kind of sort through the catalog page and or the documentation and see if you can just find those answers. So this is the catalog page for COVID-19 burden and impact in care homes, a mixed methods study. You should be able to find that information on the catalog page, but you can sort through documentation as well.
Thanks, Maureen. So we'll give about 5 to 10 minutes for this. If you have finished the task, do let us know in the chat as well, and then we can head on to answering the Mentimeter questions. And if you have any sticking points or issues when you're going through this, do pop that in the chat or the Q&A as well. Okay, so I've just popped the Mentimeter code back on the screen, so I'll just give everyone a minute to rejoin that. I can see we've got a lot of people joined, and then we'll go through and we'll see what answers we've got. So for the first question, what was the observation unit for this survey? Just give everyone a second to answer that, but it looks like everyone's agreed. Just pop your answers in if you haven't had a chance already. Okay. Yeah, and the correct answer is both. So this data was collected at both an individual and a household level. So you can see this. This is a screenshot. This is actually from, you may have noticed that if you've used our catalogue before, that it's recently been updated. This is a screenshot. This is sort of more what it looks like on the old catalogue. I've realised that I need to go through and update some of them, but it's been very exciting with the new catalogue, and this information is still the same as what it seems like all of you found on the catalogue page. So same information, but if you've used our service before and the catalogue before, you might note that it just looks slightly different. Okay, next question. What country does this data cover? Okay, give it one more minute. Okay, looks like most people are agreed. So yeah, that data covers the United Kingdom. So again, you can find that under the coverage and methodology tab on the page. And finally, if you had a chance to look at the documentation, which topic examples did you find that it covered? So I'll give a second for everyone to type in some answers. Yep, so lots of similar answers there. So I think you're all finding quite similar information. Yep, so as you can see, the data file contains this information in section 2.1. Yeah, and there's things like background variables, homeschooling, neighborhood cohesion. I know a couple of people popped volunteering in there as well, COVID symptoms and tests. So yeah, that's well done on finding all those topics. And now to part two. So what country do the data in part two cover? This is a type in your answer this time instead of a multiple choice. So what country do these data cover? Yeah, pretty solid agreement of answers there. And yeah, the answer is England. And then what kind of data are these? Are they audio recordings, numerical data, or text data? Okay. And yet they are text data. Okay, great. So that concludes our practical activity. I hope you all feel like you're a bit more to grips with documentation now. Maureen, I think can I just hand the slide sharing over to you for this section, and then we'll continue explaining some more things you might have to consider with your data.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Give me 1 second to swap over. Here we go. And let me just make that bigger. Okay. So we're going to go through just a few different data considerations. So specifically thinking about some of the sampling considerations that we have. So surveys are going to be based on samples. So you need to think about whether or not that survey sample is representative, who might be included, and who isn't included, what the response rate of that particular survey is, and whether or not there's any bias that might be built into the sampling strategy. And you need to think about whether or not you need to apply a weight then to make the data more representative. We do have a data skills module on weighting. So if you're interested in kind of honing some of your skills, do check out some of our data skills modules as well. You might also need to just think in general about the sample size. So do you have enough cases to make a precise estimates. Um, and this is particularly important if you've got a smaller subpopulation. Is that, if you're kind of breaking down and looking at a very specific group, is there actually enough there for your sample size? You can also sample across data sets. So if you are, for example, looking at a specific subgroup and there is some sort of shared social characteristic across with another data set, there might be scope to kind of mix and match there. But that does come with a little bit of a caveat because you do need to make sure that those collections would be comparable to each other. So you need to think about whether or not, for example, if it's a survey question, whether or not that needs to be harmonized across data sets, or if you're looking at more qualitative studies, you need to think about whether or not the particular context that they're working in is comparable to each other. So, for example, you can't compare single mothers living post World War II to single mothers living post, turn of the millennium. So they're very, very different contexts. So you just need to ensure that there's some comparability there between them if you're going to train sample across data sets. We do have some tips just to try and help you with this. And that's just to say the process isn't linear. So don't get too bogged down if you have to go back and, look at data sets again or revisit the sample or revisit documentation or switch tracks. Research, whether you're doing primary or secondary, is never a linear process. It can be very iterative. The other point, and I think some of you are finding this already, just looking at some of the questions that have come through, is that you may need to compromise. So if you're continually looking for the perfect data set, it's just to say that there might not be the perfect data set for the very specific range of variables, subgroup, etc., that you want to look at. So you may need to compromise a little bit, expand your topic a little bit more and perhaps explore an area that you hadn't considered before because that's where the data is. You might also need to choose different variables or different data or refine your research question to kind of suit what the existing data is. I think sometimes there is a big emphasis on looking for that perfect data set, and often somebody hasn't already done your research project and deposited the data. It's more likely that you're just going to have to see what exists on a more general topic and try and work with that. And these are some of the archive discoveries, is when you realize that this data actually has some really interesting insights. There are some other wider project considerations to make. Hopefully you are budding with some ideas of what you want to look for in the archives or some projects that you might be able to do reusing data. And if you're not collecting data yourself, you'll find that these sorts of reuse projects have very few ethical considerations. So you shouldn't hit too many snags with any ethical review boards. However, it doesn't mean that there aren't any ethical considerations or wider project considerations. So I'm just going to go over a few points on our terms and conditions, on access, and on citation. And then I think we're going to start to wrap up and signpost you to some further resources. So the first point here is around our terms and conditions. What are the limitations on your use of the data? So if you're reusing data in an established archive, like the UK Data Service, we've taken a lot of pain out of the access to those data sets by negotiating what we call a license with the person who has collected the data. And this usually means that you need to sign what's called our end user license. And this is a legal document, and you can see a snippet of it there on the left side. And it's about as fascinating and interesting as any legal document. But there's a couple of really, really important points on this document that I want to point out. And one is that there is no onward sharing of the data allowed, and that includes with your supervisor. So if you need help on your analysis and your supervisor needs to see the data, he or she will need to register and download the data for themselves. The end user license stipulates that you cannot, under any circumstance, share your data or your login with anybody. If you're accessing a shared computer, that's another thing to consider, is ensuring that others who use that computer don't just have free access to the data you've downloaded. Point two, all data has been anonymized. So that's likely to be the case if you're reusing data from an archive. However, theoretically speaking, just because it's anonymized doesn't mean that it's totally completely impossible to ever figure out the identities of the participants. I mean, there is some interesting work at the National Center for Research Methods around anonymization theory and kind of following up this idea of whether or not you can ever truly anonymize something. Um, our terms and conditions kind of cover all eventualities and just say, if you do inadvertently uncover the identity of a participant, then you agree that you won't reveal that identity to anyone. So those are two key issues to recognize when you sign the end user license. I think close to 90% of our collections will require you to sign that end user license and abide by those terms and conditions. But I did also want to quickly mention the licensing's framework, and we have had a couple questions come through about like open data, for example. So we have different levels of access. We have open, safeguarded, and controlled. Open data simply means that you can download it straight from the data catalog, no registration. And this would be applied to data that, for example, doesn't have any personal data in it, it's not on a sensitive topic, and that the researcher feels that, feels quite comfortable that no restricted access control is needed for that data. Where there are concerns, whether it is on, just because it covers a more sensitive topic, or just because that's what the researcher opts for, it might be held under our safeguarded option. And that would mean that you have to sign an end user license, which we just talked about. So there are some additional safeguards on the terms and conditions of our end user license. We also offer our most restricted access, which is the controlled option. And that's for any data which is considered potentially disclosive, particularly sensitive, etc. So access to that kind of data would only be supplied through what we call our 5 safes framework. It would require you to access the data in a secure environment. You need to undertake specialized training before you're able to get access to the data, and all of your outputs would have to be checked to ensure there's nothing identifiable in your outputs. I would point out that controlled data or anything that says special license in the title, some of you may have come across special license. It does take longer to access because you do have to undergo training and get your access sorted. Where time is restricted by your module, you may need a more straightforward option, and you may need to look specifically for safeguarded collections. Usually when we have a special license collection, there is a safeguarded version of that same collection, and it will have a few variables that are removed to open up the access level. But that is an option for those who are looking for very specific data. Once you have sorted out the access, the second point I want to make here is that you then need to ensure you are citing the data. So in short, citing archived data will help data creators track the impact of their study. It also supports reproducibility, makes it easier to find the data that you used for your project. And this issue is so important to us that we do have a page on our website which goes into more detail about data citation, and will help you explain why this is an important ethical issue. And we have made this super easy for you because on our catalog pages, you'll notice that there is a citation and copyright section. And if you if you open up that box, you will find the citation, and you can select the format that you want it in, and all you have to do is copy and paste that citation directly into your reference list. Okay, so we've got the last activity for today. So let me see here. Emma should be able to. Oh, thank you, Alle. Emma will pop the link for this in the chats, but you can, Alle is now sharing it on the screen. So we're going to ask that you download a data set. So this is from an open collection called the Pioneers of Social Research. And all you have to do is click on the link to go to that catalog page. And along the left side, you'll see a purple Access Study data box. And from there, you'll see the RTF folder. Remember, this is a rich text format. So this is the file format of this particular data. And you'll just download, if you click on that, you'll be able to download it. Don't click, I should say, the Access Online button. I mean, you can click the Access Online button. There's no problem in doing so. This collection is also available via another tool that we have called QualiBank, which we don't cover in this particular workshop. But the Access Online will take you elsewhere, and you'll need to register to access that tool, etc. So if you click on the RTF box, it should hopefully just download our download bundle for this collection for you. And there's a few prompts there of some things to explore. I'm conscious of time and we have a few more signposting, so I'll give you a couple of minutes just to see if you can download it. And what I'm going to do is just share my screen and kind of walk you through the download bundle. And if you do have any questions, you can always follow up with us as well about how to find something, or if you're having issues downloading, let us know and we can help you with that. So I'll give you a moment to try and download that and open up the folder. And what I will do is get my folder of this collection open.
Thanks, Maureen. And while you're doing that, I'm going to answer a question because I meant to type an answer, but I accidentally clicked answer live. So I'll answer that question now. So someone was asking about data sets in our collection that contain variables relating to victimization and use of social support or welfare services. The Crime Survey for England and Wales is a great one to start with for the questions about victimisation, because it asks people who have been a victim of a crime in the last 12 months. And some years of the survey may also have use of social support or welfare services in there as well. I can also suggest when you're searching our catalogue, if you use keyword and then type a keyword, things like social support or welfare, that will use our kind of embedded thesaurus to search through data sets with that topic in as well. And you can also, I would recommend, have a look at the variables tab to get an idea of some of the variable names that might cover those topics. But if you are really stuck, we'll come to this in a bit, but you can get in contact with our help desk as well, and we should be able to help you find something relevant when we've got a bit more time to look into it. Right, sorry, Maureen, back to you.
Yeah, no problem at all. So hopefully you've been able to click that download the RTF button, and it should open up a file that looks a bit like this. And if you go into it, you'll see there's a few more folders in there. So the MR doc is going to be your documentation. So if I open up this, you can see that we divide our folders into the file format. So you can find there's a consent form, there's some oral history agreements, there's an interview guide. The U list is our data list. There's also some little bios written on each of the participants for this study. Now, if we go back to the main folder, you'll see there's also that RTF folder. So guess what's in there? Our interviews. So we have both summaries of the interviews and the actual transcripts themselves. And then there's PDF versions as well of those. So in here you can see all the word processing documents that you'd be able to explore, and that's all of the data. We do also have a file information file as well as a README file. So the README file is just, we'll have a few notes about anything related to kind of the digitization of the collection. So I think one of the questions on your worksheet specifically asks about the new edition date. You'd find that kind of information in the README file. So it's worth having a click through and explore. This is a nice collection because it's an open collection, so you can just explore this one easily without having to do the registration process. I think at this point, if you have any questions, do send them through the Q&A. Otherwise, we will just get back to our further resources.
Great. Thanks, Maureen. Before we go back to that, just because I'm screen sharing anyway, there's a question in the chat about filtering available data sets to cross-national studies. Um, if I just share my screen since I have it up anyway for doing the slides, this is one of the filters available. It's under the data type filter, and then you can just select cross-national data. So I would recommend exploring that. And something else I wanted to flag is the search tips here have a lot of really detailed information on keywords and different ways of searching. So do have an explore of that as well. So I'll just bring the slides up for our further resources. Okay, so yeah, we do have some specific resources for dissertation students on our website. If you go to our Learning Hub, start from the home page, go to the Learning Hub, and then click on Students, you will find further information on things like which data sets are available and what we recommend, how you can find and access the data, and our dissertation award, which I'll come to in a minute, and then also further resources. So, and you can also um, improve your data skills and get to grips with starting with survey data or different types of data if you've never done that before by exploring our Learning Hub and in particular our data skills modules. So they will take you step by step through how to get started with different types of data, so longitudinal data, survey data, data sets on particular topics, or exploring crime data with R is one of our modules. And so I would recommend having a look at those training resources as well. One of the pages in particular I'd like to flag is our finding and accessing data for your student project page. You can find this through the student page, and this contains worksheets and videos and guidance to help you think through all of those things we've discussed today. So your data needs, searching for and evaluating data, and thinking about your project. Just to flag, because we've got our exciting new catalogue, we're still updating the resources on this page, but the functionality of the catalogue and sort of what the pages look like is similar. So if you look at some of these resources and the pages look a little bit different, don't worry, we will be updating them soon, and all of the tips and information still applies. So do have a look at those pages. The thinking through one to sort of help you define those concepts and things like that might be useful. Finally, if you are working on a dissertation that has been or will be submitted in the 2025-2026 academic year, please consider submitting it for our dissertation awards. It recognises the best 3 undergraduate dissertations on social science topics. You have to have used data from the UK Data Service catalogue for either all or part of your analysis. And like I said, submitted in the 2025 to 2026 academic year, and each winner receives a £300 reward and promotion of their project. And this will be launching soon, so do keep an eye on the dissertation award page on the website, and please do consider entering. If you follow hashtag UKDS dissertations on Blue Sky and LinkedIn, you'll get all the latest updates about our training resources relating to dissertations, the dissertation awards, and upcoming relevant events as well. And I think, Maureen, there's some further resources here.
Yeah, just to kind of help you get started with some secondary analysis. So the Timescapes Method Guide series is a really good resource. They're just kind of these short manuscripts that kind of explain different aspects of secondary analysis. If you're specifically doing quant, we do recommend the secondary analysis of quantitative data sources. We also have for qualitative the sort of main text is the secondary analysis of qualitative data. by Karen Hughes and Anna Tarrant. We also have data skills modules that I had mentioned. There's a link there for our data skills modules. So it covers a range of different skills that you might need to work through some of our data sets. We also have some video tutorials. So you can always check the listing there to see if anything is of interest to you. We've got some pages on what is secondary analysis. So if you just want to revisit some of this information, we do have it on our web pages as well. And if you're thinking you might end up doing some primary data collection at any point, it's also worth pointing out that we also have some tools and templates that might be of use. So for example, we have a model consent form. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just use and adapt the templates that we have. And we have a load of different templates for different aspects of data collection. So somebody had asked about what is the training and guidance. Not only do we host these kind of online workshops, but all of these further resources as well are all part of the service. And you can follow us. So we have a JISC mail. If you would like to sign up for our newsletter, you can do that there. If you have a very specific question, you can use our contact us page on the website. We also have a YouTube, a Blue Sky, and a LinkedIn account. So you can follow us on any of those social medias. All right. If anybody who's still remaining does have any follow-up questions, do feel free to contact us either using the web pages or pop us an email. And then once you exit from the online workshop, the evaluation survey should automatically pop up. So there's no link to it. You just kind of leave the workshop and it should pop up automatically. But I think we're all done here. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and hopefully this has been useful to get you started. Sorry about overrunning a few minutes, but hopefully you were able to get a lot out of this content.
Thanks everyone. Good luck with all of your projects.